The ocean is calm, almost deceptively so. Steel stretches across the horizon, painted in dull grey, rising and falling with the Pacific swell. It is early morning, the kind of hour when the sea carries sound farther than it should. Engines hum deep inside the hull, steady and confident. This ship was built to dominate oceans, to decide battles with a single broadside. On paper, it represents American industrial power at its peak, thousands of tons of armor, guns larger than city buses, crew quarters packed with young men who believe they are standing aboard the most powerful weapon ever to float. Photographers love it. Politicians point to it. Newspapers celebrate it as proof that the United States cannot be challenged at sea. Yet around this floating fortress, the war has already changed. Aircraft circle farther out than any battleship gun can reach. Submarines move unseen below the surface. Entire naval battles are being decided without ships ever seeing one another. This battleship will sail through the war with its reputation intact. But reputation is not the same as relevance. And as the conflict unfolds, the distance between legend and impact begins to widen, quietly, relentlessly, until the truth can no longer be ignored. That truth begins with the world that demanded this ship be built in the first place. The battleship was already an old idea by the time World War II began, but it was an idea the world still believed in. For decades, naval power had been measured in displacement and gun caliber. Treaties rose and collapsed around those numbers. The Washington Naval Treaty, the London Naval Treaty. Limits negotiated, broken, renegotiated. Each nation pretending restraint while quietly planning the next leap forward. The United States was no exception. In the 1930s, American naval doctrine remained rooted in decisive surface battle. A future war, planners believed, would be settled by massive fleets clashing across open ocean, lines of battleships exchanging salvos until one side broke. Aircraft were important, yes, but largely as scouts. Carriers were auxiliaries, battleships were the spine. Congress funded them accordingly, shipyards expanded. Steel flowed, design bureaus competed to produce something faster, heavier and more powerful than anything afloat. What emerged was a new generation of American battleships, long, fast, and armed with guns capable of firing shells weighing more than a small car over 20 miles. They were engineering triumphs, heavily armored belts, advanced fire control systems, radar integrated into gunnery, speed sufficient to keep pace with aircraft carriers, something earlier battleships could not do. On blueprints and model basins, these ships looked like the perfect answer to every naval problem. Then the war arrived early, and it arrived wrong. December 7, 1941 shattered assumptions overnight. At Pearl Harbor, battleships lay burning in shallow water while aircraft delivered the decisive blow. The lesson was immediate, but uncomfortable air power had outpaced armor. Still, battleships were not abandoned. They were repurposed. American strategy shifted toward carrier task forces, with battleships reassigned as escorts, bombardment platforms, and symbols of presence. Their guns would support landings. Their armor would absorb punishment meant for carriers. Their speed would allow them to move where older ships could not. This particular battleship entered service under that new reality. It was launched into a navy that no longer fought the war it had prepared for. Instead of leading fleets into decisive engagements, it sailed alongside carriers whose pilots now decided victory hundreds of miles away. Yet its arrival was celebrated as if nothing had changed. Commissioning ceremonies spoke of dominance. Newspapers printed silhouettes of its massive turrets. Recruitment posters leaned heavily on its image. It embodied reassurance at a moment when the United States needed visible symbols of control. Operationally, the Pacific War was sprawling and unforgiving, island by island. Atolls turned into airfields. Amphibious assaults required overwhelming firepower, and battleships provided it. Their guns softened beaches. Their anti-aircraft batteries bristled against incoming threats. But decisive engagements between battleships, once the centerpiece of naval strategy, became increasingly rare. By 1943 and 1944, the pattern was clear. The largest naval battles in history were fought almost entirely by aircraft midway the Philippine Sea, late Gulf. When battleships did meet, it was often briefly at night or under circumstances shaped by air power rather than gunnery. Still, this ship remained central in the public imagination. Its silhouette was unmistakable. Its specifications were unmatched. Its very existence suggested that no enemy surface fleet could survive contact. Yet the enemy rarely presented such an opportunity, and when they did, the battleship was often not the decisive instrument. The cost of building and maintaining such a ship was immense. Manpower counted in the thousands. fuel consumption measured in staggering quantities, dockyard resources devoted to a vessel that, increasingly, waited for a battle that never came in the form it was designed for. None of this made the ship a failure, but it raised an uncomfortable question, one rarely asked during wartime celebrations. Was this battleship truly shaping the course of the war, or was it carrying forward a prestige born of an earlier age? The answer becomes clearer when its story is examined not as legend, but from multiple perspectives: human, tactical, technological, and strategic, each revealing a different truth about what it really meant to serve aboard one of the most famous warships ever built. Life aboard the battleship was defined by scale. Everything was larger than expectation: the corridors, the machinery, the noise. Over 2,000 men lived inside a floating city of steel, each assigned a narrow role in a system that never truly slept. Many had enlisted believing they would witness history through thunderous gun battles, imagining the moment when turrets would swivel and the ship's full power would finally be unleashed. Instead, their days were dominated by drills, watches, maintenance, and long stretches of waiting. The emotional rhythm was uneven bursts of adrenaline during air raids, followed by weeks of routine escort duty. Sailors spoke later of pride, but also of confusion. They were aboard one of the most powerful ships ever built, yet often felt peripheral to the war's decisive moments. Their experience was not one of failure, but of distance, from the battles that headlines described and from the role they had trained for. Tactically, the ship was formidable but constrained. Its guns were accurate, its fire control systems among the most advanced afloat, capable of hitting targets beyond visual range. When used for shore bombardment, it was devastating. Concrete bunkers cracked, defensive positions disappeared under sustained fire, but naval combat rarely placed enemy capital ships within range. Fast-moving carrier groups dictated engagements, launching strikes long before surface contact became possible. When the battleship did fire its main guns, it was often at land, not ships. In fleet actions, its role narrowed to escort and protection, guarding carriers against surface threats that almost never materialized. The tactical doctrine that justified its existence, decisive gun engagements, remained theoretically sound, yet practically obsolete in the conditions of the Pacific War. Technologically, the battleship represented both peak innovation and creeping redundancy. Its armor was meticulously calculated to defeat shells fired by ships like itself. Its compartmentalization improved survivability. Radar allowed it to fight in darkness and bad weather, yet all of this assumed a symmetrical enemy, another battleship meeting it on roughly equal terms. Aircraft did not play by those rules. Bombs and torpedoes attacked from above and below, bypassing armor belts entirely. To compensate, the ship bristled with anti-aircraft guns, transforming its silhouette into a forest of barrels. But even then, defense was reactive. Technology had advanced faster in the air than at sea, and the battleship, for all its sophistication, was constantly adapting to threats it was never designed to face. From the perspective of leadership, the ship was both asset and liability. Admirals understood its symbolic power. Sending it into a region signaled commitment, strength, inevitability. But commanders also recognized the risk. Losing such a ship would be a strategic and psychological blow. As a result, it was used carefully, sometimes conservatively. Rarely was it allowed to operate independently. Its missions were planned to minimize exposure rather than maximize opportunity. This caution was rational, but it further limited the ship's chances to influence events directly. Leadership valued its presence, yet hesitated to gamble with it, turning the battleship into a guarded centerpiece rather than a decisive spear. From the enemy's viewpoint, the battleship inspired respect, but not fear. Japanese naval planners had already shifted their emphasis toward air power and submarines. They understood that battleships were difficult to sink, but also predictable in movement and purpose. Enemy pilots targeted carriers first. Submarine commanders hunted logistics and escorts. The battleship remained an impressive sight, but it was no longer the primary objective. It was something to avoid, bypass, or neutralize indirectly. In that sense, its reputation outpaced its actual threat. The enemy acknowledged its strength, yet structured their strategy around weapons that made such strength increasingly irrelevant. Taken together, these perspectives converge on a quiet realization. The battleship was powerful, respected, and competently used, but it existed in a war that had already moved past the kind of dominance it was built to deliver. That realization would become impossible to ignore during the moments when its presence mattered most. and when expectations collided with reality under the pressure of combat. The turning point does not arrive with a single explosion. It unfolds across days of movement, radio reports, and missed opportunities during the largest naval confrontation of the war, October 1944. The Philippine Sea and the waters surrounding Leyte Gulf become the focal point of Japanese desperation and American momentum. The United States is returning to the Philippines, and the Imperial Japanese Navy commits nearly everything it has left. Battleships, cruisers, carriers, many damaged, many undercrewed, are thrown into a complex, multi-pronged operation intended to shatter the invasion fleet. This is the moment battleships were built for: surface combat, enemy capital ships, confined waters where air power might be limited by weather and distance. The stage seems finally set for decisive gunfire. The American battleship is present. It moves with Task Force 34, fast, heavily armed, radar-equipped. Its guns are ready. Fire control teams are trained and alert. For the first time, the possibility of engaging enemy battleships is not theoretical, yet the battle fractures almost immediately. Japanese forces approach from multiple directions. Carriers without aircraft act as decoys. Submarines and aircraft strike first, shaping events long before surface fleets can meet. Command decisions are made under pressure, based on incomplete information. The American battleship group is pulled north, chasing what appears to be the primary threat. It is not. While powerful ships steam away at full speed, a smaller American escort force near Samar faces overwhelming odds. Destroyers and escort carriers engage Japanese heavy units in one of the most uneven fights in naval history. They fight with smoke, torpedoes, and audacity, buying time at terrible risk. The battleship remains out of range. When contact with Japanese surface forces finally occurs elsewhere in the Gulf, it is brief and decisive, but not because of sustained battleship duels. Radar, directed fire sinks enemy ships already battered by air attack and confusion. The engagements are important, but they are not the epic confrontations once imagined. They are closing acts, not centerpieces. For the American battleship, this is the quiet realization point. It performs exactly as designed. It is fast, it is accurate, it is deadly. But the war has already been decided elsewhere, by pilots, by submariners, by small ships acting with disproportionate courage. After Leyte Gulf, there will be no remaining enemy fleet capable of challenging American control of the sea. The battleship will continue to serve, bombarding shores, escorting carriers, absorbing attention, but the last chance for it to define the war has passed without the defining moment ever truly arriving. The guns remain powerful, the ship remains intact, but the era it was built to dominate ends not with defeat, but with irrelevance quietly setting in beneath the sound of victory. What follows is not decline, but reassessment, measured in reports, post-war evaluations, and the growing understanding of what the ship achieved, and what it never could. When the war moves beyond Leyte Gulf, the battleship continues to sail, but the tone has changed. The urgency is gone. The enemy fleet no longer exists as a coherent force. What remains are islands, airfields, and entrenched positions that must be reduced methodically. In this environment, the battleship finds work, but not purpose in the way it was once imagined. Its guns are turned toward shore. During operations at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, heavy naval bombardment becomes a daily routine. The ship fires thousands of rounds. Hills are stripped bare. Concrete emplacements collapse. The psychological effect on defenders is severe. Survivors describe the shelling as unrelenting, impossible to escape. From a purely destructive standpoint, the battleship is devastating. But reports tell a more complex story. Post-action analyses reveal that while bombardment suppresses enemy positions, it rarely destroys deeply buried defenses completely. Infantry still must advance. Casualties still occur. The battleship's firepower, while immense, is only one part of a combined system that relies on air strikes, artillery, and ground assault. It is powerful but not decisive on its own. The ship's anti-aircraft role becomes increasingly prominent as Japanese tactics shift toward kamikaze attacks. The battleship's layered defenses help protect carrier groups and transport fleets. Its decks shake under near misses. Shrapnel scars the superstructure. Men are killed and wounded by aircraft that break through the defensive curtain. The ship survives, but survival becomes the measure of success rather than dominance. Strategically, the numbers are impossible to ignore. The battleship consumes enormous resources: fuel, maintenance time, skilled labor. Its crew alone could man several smaller ships. In contrast, aircraft carriers project power hundreds of miles away with fewer personnel relative to impact. Submarines quietly sever supply lines with minimal visibility. Destroyers and escorts fight constantly, often under far greater risk. After the war, the accounting begins. Naval planners review performance reports with brutal clarity. Battleships did not lose the war, but they did not win it either. Their contributions are acknowledged, respected, and then quietly contextualized. Carrier aviation is recognized as the decisive arm. Amphibious doctrine evolves around air superiority and logistics rather than gun caliber. The battleship's public image, however, remains largely untouched. Victory parades feature its silhouette. Photographs emphasize its size and power. Veterans remember it with pride, and rightly so, but institutional memory separates symbolism from strategy. Within a few years, the ship is placed in reserve. Its guns fall silent. Maintenance crews shrink. New generations of officers train on carriers and submarines instead. When discussions of future wars arise, the battleship is rarely mentioned as a central solution. What lingers is not failure, but misalignment. The ship performed every task assigned to it competently. It never disgraced itself, yet it never fulfilled the role for which it was designed because the war demanded something different. That gap between expectation and reality is where the label, overrated, quietly takes shape, not as an insult, but as a historical correction that becomes clearer with time and distance. That realization invites a final question, not about the ship alone, but about how wars are remembered and how power is often mistaken for importance. Calling something overrated in war is not the same as calling it useless. It is a statement about proportion, about how much weight history gives to an object compared to what it actually changed. This American battleship was a masterpiece of engineering. It represented the peak of an era that believed dominance could be measured in steel thickness and gun caliber. Every rivet, every turret, every calculation behind its design reflected decades of hard-earned naval experience. Nothing about it was careless. Nothing about it was weak. But wars do not wait for perfection. They reward adaptability. They punish certainty. By the time this ship entered combat, the center of gravity had already shifted upward and outward into the sky, into long-range detection, into forces that could strike without ever being seen. The battleship became a supporting actor in a war it was built to headline. It protected others. It shattered coastlines. It endured attacks that would have destroyed lesser vessels. Yet its presence rarely altered enemy decisions or dictated outcomes. The enemy planned around it, not against it. Victory flowed through channels it could not control. That is why reputation matters. In the American memory of World War II, battleships still loom large, massive, visible, reassuring. They feel decisive because they look decisive. But history, when examined closely, is quieter and less sentimental. It measures influence, not impression. This ship's legacy is not one of failure, but of transition. It marks the moment when industrial power alone stopped being enough. When speed, information, and reach overtook mass and armor. When warfare moved beyond the horizon and beyond the gun barrel. For the men who served aboard it, none of this diminishes their experience. They stood watch. They faced danger. They did their duty inside a machine that demanded precision and courage. Their story remains part of the war's human fabric. But for history, the lesson is broader. Great weapons can arrive too late for the war they were designed to fight. Prestige can outlast relevance. And victory often belongs not to the most impressive instrument, but to the one that fits the moment best. The battleship sailed through World War II intact, respected and celebrated. What it did not sail through was the future it was built for, and that quiet truth is what ultimately defines it, not as a symbol of defeat, but as a monument to how quickly warfare leaves even the mightiest creations behind.